Of the 15,400 men buried in the Fredericksburg National Cemetery, more than 12,700 of them were buried unidentified. And you can see that visually as you look through the cemetery. You may have even noticed already that there are several different headstones, styles of headstones. There are sort of the larger, taller ones that are maybe sort of what you think of when you think of National Cemetery headstones. And there are sort of those small, squat ones that are low to the ground and kind of square looking. Those are the unknowns. And unfortunately, we have the highest percentage of unknown burials of any national cemetery in the system. 83.5% of the men buried in our cemetery are unknown. And a lot of that simply comes down to the fact that the vast majority of the men buried in our cemetery were actually killed in combat during the war. And the process of identifying a Civil War soldier killed during the war, once the war was over, was incredibly difficult and very unlikely to be successful. There's no dog tags, there's no dental records, they're a century away from doing DNA. The quality of wartime burials was almost universally extremely poor, and the amount of information that was left on those burials was almost always very little. To give you an idea of the kind of efforts that might be made by Civil War soldiers to leave information on the graves of the slain, occasional burial parties would find portions of names, last names, first names, or maybe even simply just initials. Without other information, that often was not enough to properly identify them. In some instances, Civil War soldiers might go to greater lengths to try and preserve the information of the dead. One New Hampshire soldier included a corked and sealed bottle in the grave of a comrade, for example, to try and better preserve the paper in which a slain comrade's information was written on. In the 1930s, a set of human remains was found with a stone with the name Dan scratched into it to attempt to identify the body. Obviously, whoever made that attempt never had the opportunity to come back and recover that comrade. Now, to give you an idea of how that could sometimes go right, and the efforts that Civil War soldiers could sometimes go to, and what was sometimes necessary for a battlefield death to result in a soldier actually being buried with their name, I'm going to highlight Hiram Lare in plot 3247 behind me, marked by the lantern. Hiram Lare was a 21-year-old boatman. He enlisted in the 95th Pennsylvania in 1861 for a 3-year contract. He survived the full extent of that 3-year contract. At the end of those 3 years, he apparently decided he hadn't done enough, so he re-enlisted. Unfortunately for him, on May 12th, 1864, he's killed during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. In the aftermath of his death, one of his comrades, John Cook, himself wounded, stayed with Lare's body to protect it and to ensure it received the best burial it possibly could. Upon burying it, his name and information was carved into the leather lid of a cartridge box, the cartridge box being the large leather pouch that Civil War soldiers carried their ammunition in, and that served as the only identifying mark on Lare's simple battlefield grave. More than 60 years after the war, Cook had no idea whether or not his efforts had succeeded. In 1931, Lare reached out, trying to find out if anybody knew what had happened to his comrade. And he received a letter back from a Major Wilborn of the United States Army, who at that point in the 1930s, the War Department still managed the Fredericksburg National Cemetery, informing Cook that not only had his efforts succeeded, but that Lare had in fact been fully identified when the Army went through the process of disinterring and reinterring the dead in 1867, and that he had been successfully buried here in the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. Cook responded to Major Wilborn with the following letter. I cannot express my sincere appreciation of your kindness in telling me that my dear soldier friend and messmate had an honorable burial. The day after he was killed, I sat with a wounded leg on the ground beside his body and begged some men to dig a hole with their bayonets. His body was scarcely covered, but the boys did the best they could, and I thanked them as the tears almost choked me as I tried to talk. I was several years younger than Hiram and was a frail boy as compared to his muscular frame. He was the best friend I ever had. Many times he gave me his last cracker and the last drop from his canteen. For 67 years I have wondered and worried if his body had a soldier's resting place, not the bloody spot I saw at last. I wish it was possible for me to lay a rose on his grave on May 30th as a token of love and gratitude for him that has never died. John Cook would go on to make arrangements with the National Cemetery to have, in fact, a rose laid on his grave on May 30th, 1831, 86 years ago, actually 87 years ago now, for that year's annual Memorial Day celebrations. And we have gone and placed a rose on his grave today. As it's getting darker, it's getting hard to see. You'll just have to trust me that it's there. But sometimes that's what it took. It took a wounded man personally shepherding the body of a fallen comrade, literally begging other men to help him bury it, to make sure that it had even the slightest chance of being buried with its name, with their name, years later. And even then, sometimes it took 67 years for them to find out if they had even succeeded.